deadly love triangle, a fatal affair between brothers. Criminal story. Mike and Aaron had always been two halves of the same whole, inseparable since childhood. From the moment they were born, it was clear that they were meant to be more than just brothers. They were best friends, partners in every adventure, and allies in every mischief. Their parents, busy with their careers, had never imposed rigid expectations on their sons. Instead, they trusted that the boys would figure things out on their own. And figure things out they did, together. Mike, the older of the two, took on the role of protector, while Aaron, the quieter and more introspective of the pair, was the thinker. Though they had their differences in personality, the bond between them was unbreakable. Before we can continue, if you love crime stories, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Growing up in a small, suburban town, Mike and Aaron lived in a world of their own making. Their house, a modest two-story with a white picket fence, was filled with the sound of their laughter, the creaking of their bikes on the pavement, and the smell of fresh cookies baking in the oven. They were the kind of brothers who could finish each other's sentences, who had secret handshakes no one else knew, and who could communicate 1,000 things with just a look. For years, they had been the nucleus of a tight-knit trio, their best friend being Julia, a girl who had lived on their street since they were all very young. Julia was the kind of girl who could get along with anyone. She was funny, intelligent, and most notably, kind, something that had drawn both brothers to her over time. The three of them spent every free moment together. They would walk to the park after school, ride their bikes to the local convenience store, and spend hours chatting about everything and nothing. There was an ease in their relationship, a simplicity that made the outside world seem less important. Julia, with her big brown eyes and infectious laugh, became the glue that held Mike and Aaron's world together. It was clear from the beginning that Julia was special. But, as is the way with the passing of time, the nature of their relationships began to shift as they moved from childhood into adolescence. What had once been a platonic friendship started to take on a new dimension. Puberty brought with it the confusing stirrings of romantic attraction, and suddenly, the dynamics between the three friends shifted. Mike, ever the outgoing and charming one, was the first to realize that he was no longer just a protector or a companion to Julia. He was in love with her. Mike never spoke of it, though. He buried his feelings deep, knowing that Julia seemed to gravitate more toward Aaron. Aaron, unlike Mike, was quieter, more introspective, and perhaps even more deeply sensitive. Julia and Aaron had always shared a bond that went beyond their mutual friendship with Mike. There was something about the way Aaron looked at her, a softness in his eyes when she laughed, that made it clear to anyone paying attention that he had feelings for her that went beyond friendship. Mike had always been a dominant force in the group. His outgoing personality and natural leadership qualities had often placed him in the role of the center of attention, but he began to notice how easily Julia and Aaron communicated. Their conversations, once lighthearted and carefree, began to have an undercurrent of intimacy. The way they exchanged glances, the way their fingers would brush against each other in passing, it was all so painfully obvious to Mike. And yet, he never said anything. The thought of confessing his feelings to Julia, of risking the years of friendship he had with both her and Aaron, terrified him. So, he kept his emotions locked away, pretending that everything was fine, even as a small, quiet storm of jealousy brewed inside him. It was a storm that he would ignore for as long as he could, until it could no longer be suppressed. As time went on, Julia and Aaron's relationship blossomed into something undeniable. The more time they spent together, the deeper their connection grew. They began to date seriously, and soon it was clear to everyone that they were in love. For Mike, it felt like a punch to the gut. He watched helplessly as the girl he had secretly loved for so long chose his brother over him. It wasn't that he resented Aaron, at least not at first, but the sting of rejection was impossible to ignore. Julia, the girl who had always been a part of their trio, was now Aaron's. In the months that followed, Mike's feelings became harder to suppress. He found himself at odds with the natural progression of events. While Aaron and Julia flourished in their relationship, Mike began to resent the way things had turned out. He couldn't help but feel betrayed by both of them, though he would never admit it. After all, Aaron and Julia were happy together. What right did he have to stand in the way of that? But Mike was not one to let go of things easily, especially when it came to something as important as love. And deep down, he wasn't sure if he wanted to let go. The change in their dynamic became more pronounced. What had once been an effortless camaraderie among the three of them was now strained. The simple moments they once shared, movie nights, walks to the store, even the occasional sleepover, felt forced. Aaron and Julia, ever the affectionate couple, would sit too close, share too many inside jokes, and hold hands too tightly. Meanwhile, Mike, always the third wheel, could only watch from the outside, pretending not to care. But the jealousy festered. It wasn't just about Julia anymore. It was about the fact that his brother, his closest ally, had somehow come to embody everything that Mike had wanted. Julia, yes, but also the kind of connection with someone that Mike had always craved, a deep, undeniable bond. Mike tried to manage his feelings. He convinced himself that Aaron deserved Julia, that they were a perfect match, and that he should be happy for them. After all, what was the point in dwelling on something that could never be? He even began to distance himself, taking on new hobbies, spending more time with friends outside the group, and deflecting any attempt to rekindle the old bond with Aaron and Julia. But even as he tried to move forward, the sense of loss never left him. It simmered beneath the surface, something he couldn't escape. The more Mike thought about it, the more he began to convince himself that he had been wronged. It wasn't just the rejection from Julia, it was the way Aaron seemed oblivious to Mike's growing frustration. Mike felt as though he had been left behind, replaced by the love his brother shared with Julia. And as much as he tried to bury it, a sense of entitlement began to creep in. He had been there first, hadn't he? Julia had been his friend before she had been Aaron's girlfriend. They had shared a bond, a history, that seemed to pale in comparison to the new one they were building. At first, Mike's bitterness took on subtle forms. He would show up unannounced at Aaron and Julia's house, acting like nothing was wrong, but always with an underlying sense of tension. He'd make little comments, sometimes about how they were spending too much time together, or how Aaron had changed since meeting Julia. It wasn't overt hostility, but a quiet undercurrent of resentment. For his part, Aaron tried to ignore the tension, choosing to believe that his brother would eventually come to terms with the relationship. He didn't want to confront Mike directly, not wanting to add fuel to the fire. But deep down, Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There were times when Mike would give him a look, or when he would try to engage in a conversation that felt more like a challenge than a dialogue. Still, Aaron tried to convince himself that Mike was just going through a phase, that his bitterness would eventually subside. Julia, ever the peacemaker, tried to mediate between the brothers. She had noticed the shift in the dynamics as well, but she didn't know how to fix it. She didn't want to lose either of them. Mike had been her friend for years, and Aaron was her boyfriend, someone she loved deeply. She wished they could return to the days when everything had been simple and easy, when they had been a perfect trio. But as time wore on, she began to realize that this wasn't just about her or Aaron. This was about something much deeper, something that neither she nor Aaron could fix. And so, life continued in a quiet dissonance. Julia and Aaron's relationship grew stronger, and Mike's resentment deepened, though he tried to keep it hidden beneath the surface. The three of them continued to share moments, but there was always a lingering tension, a palpable sense that the harmony they once had was gone, never to return. Mike couldn't ignore the feeling that something was missing, that he had lost a piece of himself. But no matter how much he tried to reclaim what he thought was rightfully his, the more distant the connection between them all became. Little did they know, this fragile piece wouldn't last forever. The cracks in the brothers' relationship would soon widen, and the dark seeds of jealousy and resentment that Mike had been nurturing for months would soon break through the surface, in ways none of them could have predicted. Mike's mind had always been a labyrinth of competing desires, but nothing in his life had consumed him like the desire to be with Julia. At first, it had been a quiet longing, something he could suppress with distractions or ignore with alcohol, friends, and work. But as time passed, his feelings grew more intense and less manageable. What had once been a gentle yearning for her attention had morphed into a full-blown obsession. Every time he saw Julia laughing with Aaron, or the way Aaron looked at her with that soft, affectionate gaze, it felt like a physical ache in Mike's chest. The more he tried to bury these feelings, the stronger they became, until they threatened to overwhelm every corner of his mind. Mike had always been a man of action. He liked to control the circumstances of his life, to carve out his own path, even if that meant being a little brash, a little forceful at times. This quality had served him well throughout his life. It was part of why he'd always been the center of attention in any social group, part of why he was respected in his career. People liked Mike because he knew what he wanted and wasn't afraid to go after it. But with Julia, it was different. His usual methods of seduction and charm had failed him. No matter how often he tried to make her laugh, no matter how hard he tried to be the life of the party whenever they were together, it was clear that Julia didn't see him the way he saw her. At first, Mike had convinced himself that it wasn't a big deal. After all, he had Aaron, and Aaron was his brother. He should want the best for him, right? But that sentiment quickly turned into frustration, as if a door in his heart had been closed off and locked. Mike couldn't escape the fact that Julia had chosen Aaron. That, despite the closeness he shared with her, despite the years of camaraderie they had enjoyed, it was his brother who had won her love. It wasn't just that Aaron was his brother, it was the fact that Aaron seemed to be everything Mike wasn't. Where Mike was bold, Aaron was quiet and thoughtful. Where Mike could charm a room with ease, Aaron commanded respect through his sincerity. As Aaron and Julia's relationship blossomed, Mike's jealousy began to consume him, creeping into every aspect of his life. He could feel it gnawing at him every time he saw them together. He hated himself for it. He hated the way Aaron's mere presence would quiet the room, the way Julia's eyes would light up when she saw him. Mike had always prided himself on being the more charismatic of the two brothers, but with Julia, it was Aaron who seemed to have all of her attention. And that burned him. It burned in a way that no other rivalry or competition ever had. This was more than just a crush. This was something deeper, something that threatened to break the very foundation of the bond between the two brothers. It didn't help that Mike was constantly surrounded by reminders of Julia and Aaron's relationship. They were always together, it seemed. At work, at family gatherings, at the places they used to hang out. It was as if they were a package deal, inseparable. Mike, the odd one out, began to notice how quickly his role in their dynamic had shifted. He was no longer the center of Julia's world. He was no longer the person she turned to when she needed advice or comfort. That position was now occupied by Aaron. There were small moments that dug into Mike's psyche. The way Julia would touch Aaron's arm casually when they spoke, how they would share inside jokes that Mike wasn't a part of. To anyone else, these moments would have seemed innocent, natural even, but to Mike, they were like daggers. Every time he saw them together, it was a reminder of his own rejection. Mike tried to brush it off. He told himself he was being childish, that he should be happy for his brother. After all, Aaron was a good guy, kind, genuine, someone who truly cared about Julia. But even as he told himself these things, the jealousy inside him festered. It was no longer about Julia. It was about power, control, and the feeling of being left behind. Mike's thoughts spiraled further as he began to convince himself that Aaron hadn't just won Julia's heart. He had taken something from Mike, something that belonged to him. In his mind, Julia was not just another girl. She was the one. She was the key to his happiness, the answer to everything that had felt wrong in his life. And now, she was lost to him forever. The more Mike reflected on his feelings, the more obsessed he became. He started seeking out ways to be close to Julia again. At first, it was subtle, small gestures, a message here and there, trying to re-establish the connection they had once shared. He would text her, sometimes just to check in, sometimes with a joke or an observation he knew would make her smile. But every time he did, he could feel the distance between them growing. The conversations were never as easy as they used to be. Julia was always polite, but there was an underlying tension in her responses, a sense that she was holding something back, like she knew what Mike was really trying to do. And yet, Mike couldn't stop himself. The desire to reclaim what he felt was rightfully his. Julia's affection, her attention, became all-consuming. He found himself showing up at their house unexpectedly, sitting in the background while Aaron and Julia carried on their conversations. He would offer unsolicited advice or crack jokes just to remind them that he was still part of the picture. Sometimes, when they weren't paying attention, Mike would stare at Julia for just a little too long, trying to memorize the curve of her smile, the way her hair cascaded over her shoulder. He was searching for something, anything, that might allow him to slip back into the place he once held in her life. The more Mike clung to these small gestures, the more desperate he became. He started calling Julia more often, under the pretense of checking in on her. He would drop by Aaron's apartment unexpectedly, pretending that he had nothing to do, just wanting to catch up. But deep down, Mike knew that his motives were far more selfish. He wasn't just trying to reconnect with his old friend. He was trying to win her back, to wedge himself between her and Aaron, to reclaim a piece of her that he believed had been stolen. Aaron, of course, had begun to notice these changes. He noticed how Mike would linger a little too long, how he would act out of character, more needy, more insistent on inserting himself into their lives. It wasn't something Aaron could put his finger on exactly, but he felt it. He noticed how Mike would pull Julia aside for private conversations, how he would make offhand remarks about their relationship, as though testing the waters for an opening. Aaron tried to brush it off, assuming that Mike was just struggling with the changes in their dynamic. After all, it wasn't easy being the third wheel, especially when you had once been so close to both of them. But there was an edge to Mike's behavior, a hint of something darker that Aaron couldn't ignore. Julia, too, began to feel uneasy. At first, she thought Mike's attempts to reconnect were harmless. After all, they had been friends for so long. But the more he reached out, the more Julia started to question his intentions. She knew Mike well enough to understand that he wasn't acting out of simple friendship anymore. His words, his gestures, his eyes, they all carried an undertone of something deeper, something that made her uncomfortable. She found herself distancing herself from Mike, politely declining his invitations, responding more curtly to his texts. It wasn't that she didn't care about him, it was just that things had changed. Aaron was her boyfriend now, and she couldn't allow herself to be drawn into the emotional web Mike was trying to spin. Still, the more she pulled away, the more Mike pressed forward. It was as if his desire for Julia had become an insatiable hunger, and he would do anything to feed it. Every interaction, no matter how brief, became an opportunity for him to subtly assert his claim. He began sending her long, heartfelt messages, pouring his emotions onto the screen, hoping she would understand how much he had always cared for her. But Julia, sensing the shift in his behavior, began to grow wary. She didn't know what Mike was hoping for, but she knew that this wasn't the friendship they had once shared. Mike wasn't the same person anymore. It was around this time that Mike's feelings of inadequacy began to morph into something darker. He stopped seeing Aaron as just his brother. Aaron became a rival, an obstacle standing between him and the one thing he wanted more than anything else. The resentment simmered beneath the surface, turning into something toxic. Every time Aaron would look at Julia with affection, or when Julia would lean in to kiss him, Mike's blood would boil. It wasn't just jealousy anymore, it was hatred. Hatred for the situation. Hatred for his own inability to move on. But mostly, it was hatred for his brother, for taking something that he had always wanted, even if he hadn't known it until it was too late. In his mind, Mike had become the victim. He had been wronged by both Aaron and Julia, and this injustice began to consume him. The more he stewed over it, the more desperate he became. He told himself that if he could just find a way to get Julia alone, to talk to her in private, he could convince her to see him the way he had always hoped. The thought of his brother standing in the way of that, the very same brother who had everything Mike had ever wanted, was too much to bear. It became clear to him. Something had to change. He couldn't go on like this. If he wanted Julia, he would have to take her, no matter the cost. The decision to confront the growing storm of feelings that had been brewing inside Mike for so long wasn't something he made lightly. It wasn't an impulse or a snap decision. No, this had been coming for months. But as the days passed, and as he watched Aaron and Julia grow closer, Mike felt like a man being pushed to the edge of a cliff, his feet no longer sure of the ground beneath him. And the more he tried to ignore his feelings, the more they became impossible to suppress. What had once been a quiet desire now roared like a wildfire in his chest, consuming everything in its path. Mike's sense of powerlessness began to gnaw at him. As no longer content to sit on the sidelines of his own life. In the past, whenever something had gone wrong, whether it was with his career, his friendships, or even in his family, he had always found a way to regain control. He took risks, acted decisively, and made things happen. But with Julia, it felt different. He couldn't act the way he had in the past. No amount of charm or charisma could break through the wall that now stood between them. He was locked in a game he didn't know how to play, and for the first time in his life, he felt like a passive observer in his own story. That sense of powerlessness was maddening. Mike hated feeling like the victim, hated the way the roles had reversed, with Aaron as the winner, and he, Mike, as the one left with nothing. He had always been the dominant one in the family. He was the older brother, the more outgoing one, the one who seemed to always be in control. But now, everything seemed to slip through his fingers, and it was Aaron who held the reins of his own life, and Julia's. It didn't matter how much Mike wanted to pretend otherwise, or how often he tried to convince himself that his feelings for Julia were just a passing phase. It was all a lie. So, in a moment of raw, desperate clarity, Mike realized that he couldn't keep pretending anymore. He couldn't go on living in the shadows of his own feelings. If he wanted Julia, if he wanted any chance of reclaiming what he felt had been stolen from him, he would have to take action. No more hiding behind passive attempts to reach out to her. No more waiting for her to come to him. He had to put himself front and center to force her to see him in the way he believed he deserved to be seen. It wasn't just about Julia anymore, it was about control, about taking back the narrative of his own life. His plan wasn't a carefully calculated scheme, nor was it something he had worked out in advance. It was a raw, emotional decision that felt, at the time, like the only option left. He had to confront the issue head-on, to make Julia see that he wasn't just a bystander in his own life. And most importantly, he had to challenge Aaron, to show him that he wasn't the only one who could claim Julia's heart. The idea of confrontation wasn't foreign to Mike. He had done it before in other aspects of his life. But with Aaron, with the person he had shared everything with for so long, it felt like an impossible task. He couldn't bring himself to simply ask Aaron to step aside. No, that would have been too easy, too clean. Instead, he had to force the situation, to make the dynamic shift in a way that would leave him at the center. Mike's first step was to infiltrate their world again. He knew he couldn't just walk back into their lives like nothing had changed. Aaron and Julia had grown closer in ways that Mike could not undo, and the distance between him and them was vast. But Mike was determined to close that gap, no matter what it took. So he started showing up at their favorite hangouts. At first, it seemed like an innocent decision, a casual drop-in. He would show up at the bar where they had all spent countless evenings in their youth, acting like it was just another night with old friends. At first, Aaron was a little surprised by Mike's sudden reappearance, but he didn't say anything. He assumed Mike was simply trying to reconnect. After all, family was important, and the bond between brothers wasn't something that could be broken overnight. But there was a change in Mike, a shift that was impossible to ignore. His usual easygoing charm was now laced with an undercurrent of something more calculating, more intent. Every word he spoke to Julia felt charged, as if he was trying to stake some claim on her attention, even though he knew she had made her choice. He made sure to be there whenever they were, lingering in the background, making sly remarks that always seemed to direct the conversation back to him. And while he never overtly challenged Aaron for Julia's affection, his presence created an unspoken tension, a constant reminder that Mike was still there, still present in ways that felt intrusive. Julia, for her part, tried to brush it off. She thought Mike was simply struggling with the changes in their relationship, perhaps feeling left out, perhaps missing the days when the three of them were inseparable. But the more Mike inserted himself into their interactions, the more Julia began to sense that there was something deeper at play. Mike wasn't just trying to reconnect with old friends. No, there was a desperation in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. And worse, she could feel a shift in her own reactions to him. The subtle touches, the lingering glances, they weren't innocent anymore. They were reminders of a past that was no longer hers to claim. But Mike wasn't interested in subtlety. He wasn't content with playing the background character in his own life. And so, one evening, he took it a step further. They had all gathered for a family dinner. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just an evening with their parents, laughing over takeout, telling stories from their childhoods. But for Mike, the moment felt charged with something far darker, something he couldn't control. As the night wore on, Mike felt a rising sense of panic, the kind of panic that comes when you realize you're running out of time. His jealousy, his frustration, everything he had bottled up for months was beginning to boil over. He couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't sit in the background of his own life. So, without warning, he stood up from the table, his chair scraping against the floor loudly. Everyone paused and turned to him. "Aaron, can I talk to you for a minute?" Mike's voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that made Julia's stomach churn. Aaron looked at him, a little surprised, but nodded. "Sure, Mike. What's up?" Mike led his brother out to the back porch. The night air was cool against his skin, but inside, his blood was boiling. This was it, the moment he had been building toward for months. He couldn't back down now. "Aaron," Mike began, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "I need to talk to you about something." Aaron looked at him, his brow furrowed with concern. "What's going on, man?" Mike paused, his fists clenching at his sides. He was afraid of what he might say, of how far this could go, but he couldn't stop himself. The words were already spilling out, and they couldn't be taken back. "It's about Julia." Aaron froze. A tense silence settled between them. Mike could see the subtle shift in his brother's expression, something between confusion and wariness. "Mike," Aaron said slowly, "we've been over this. Julia and I are together. I thought you were okay with that." Mike shook his head, his frustration growing. "I'm not okay with it, Aaron," he snapped. "I never was. I've been watching you two for months, and I can't pretend anymore. I'm not just going to sit here and watch you take everything from me. Not her. Not Julia." The words hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Mike could see Aaron's face harden, and he knew he had crossed a line. The quiet tension that had always existed between the two of them was gone. There was only the storm now, the storm of Mike's emotions, and the reality that Aaron was seeing him for the first time as something else, a rival, a threat. Aaron took a step back, his hands raised in a defensive gesture. "Mike, you're my brother. This isn't you. I don't know what's going on with you, but I'm not going to fight you over Julia." "Oh, it's not just about her anymore," Mike spat, the venom in his words surprising even himself. "It's about everything. About how you've always had what I wanted. You think I haven't noticed? You think I don't see how you've taken everything from me? Well, I'm done being your shadow, Aaron. I'm done standing by and letting you get everything you want. I deserve more than this." Aaron stood there, shock and disbelief written all over his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with the tension of years of unspoken resentment, a bond that had once been unbreakable now fraying at the edges. And then, in one moment, it all unraveled. After the confrontation, Mike was forced to come to terms with a new reality he had created, a reality where the simmering tension between him and Aaron could no longer be ignored. The words that had come pouring out of him on that fateful night were like poison, their toxicity sinking into the very marrow of his bones. The aftermath was a strange and oppressive silence that seemed to hang over him, suffocating him at every turn. In that instant, Mike realized that his attempt to claim power, to seize control over the situation, had only left him more vulnerable than ever. The brother he had once trusted without question now regarded him with a mixture of disbelief and wariness. And Julia, who had once been a source of comfort, now seemed like an unattainable prize that he had alienated with his reckless actions. For days after the confrontation, Mike could barely look at himself in the mirror. He didn't know what he had expected to happen when he finally confronted Aaron, but this wasn't it. The fallout was swift and brutal. Aaron had cut him off, perhaps not entirely, but in ways that were undeniable. The brotherly bond they had shared, the unspoken understanding that had always existed between them, now felt fractured beyond repair. There was no going back to the way things were. No amount of apologies, no grand gestures, could undo the damage Mike had done by making his feelings known. Mike didn't want to admit it, but deep down, he knew he had crossed a line. His jealousy, his desire for Julia, had led him to a place he could never have imagined. There was no easy way out now. His relationship with Aaron, once a pillar of his life, was crumbling before his eyes, and the more Mike thought about it, the more he realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of that realization pressed down on him every time he saw his brother's face, every time he caught sight of Julia's smile, every time he realized he no longer had a place in their world. As the days passed, Mike began to find solace in a new routine. It was a routine born out of necessity, out of the need to fill the void left by the collapse of his relationship with Aaron. But it wasn't a healthy routine, far from it. It was a routine built on bitterness and resentment. It was a routine that pushed him further into the spiral of isolation that had already begun the moment he made the fateful decision to confront his brother. He spent long hours at the bar, drowning himself in alcohol as a way to numb the gnawing pain in his chest. He pushed away the people who had once been his friends, preferring to be alone with his thoughts, even if those thoughts were slowly destroying him. The loneliness that began to seep into his life felt different now. At first, he had thought that distancing himself from Aaron and Julia was just temporary. He would need time to cool off, time to process his feelings. But the more time passed, the more it became clear that things weren't going to get better. The distance between him and his brother had widened to an almost unbearable degree. There were no late-night talks anymore. No more inside jokes shared between the two of them. No more casual hangouts. The things that had once connected them now seemed like distant memories, fading further and further with each passing day. And it wasn't just Aaron that he had alienated. Julia, too, was slipping away from him. She hadn't directly confronted him after their fight, but her absence in his life was palpable. She was avoiding him, and Mike knew why. He had pushed her too far, driven by his own jealousy and desperation to reclaim something that had never truly been his. In trying to take control of the situation, he had lost both of them. But the worst part of it all was the quiet realization that Mike had become his own worst enemy. He had become someone he didn't recognize. He had allowed his obsession with Julia to cloud his judgment, to dictate his actions, and now he was paying the price. Every time he looked at the phone or the empty spaces in his life, it felt like a reminder of how far he had fallen. He knew what he had to do to fix things, to repair the bonds he had broken. But he didn't know if it was even possible anymore. He didn't know if Aaron would ever forgive him, or if Julia would ever look at him the same way again. All the control he had once believed he could claim was slipping further and further from his grasp. The days turned into weeks, and Mike's resentment began to take on a new form. He wasn't just angry at Aaron anymore. He wasn't just angry at Julia. He was angry at himself. Angry for being so weak, so powerless in the face of his own emotions. Anger had become a constant companion, something that clouded his mind and made it difficult for him to think clearly. The urge to reclaim what he had lost, to force things back into alignment, became more pressing with each passing day. But it wasn't just a desire anymore, it was a need. It was as if everything in his life depended on fixing what he had broken. The thought of losing Aaron, of losing Julia, was too much to bear. In the midst of this emotional turmoil, Mike started to take more drastic actions. If he couldn't have the relationships he once had, if he couldn't force things back into place with his brother, then maybe he could force Julia to notice him again. Maybe he could push past the walls she had erected around herself. The idea of seducing her back into his life was a temptation he couldn't resist. But he knew it couldn't be the same as it was before. He couldn't just walk back into her life with charm and a smile. No, he would have to make her see him in a way that she hadn't before. He would have to make her feel something for him, anything so that he could reclaim the power he had lost. It was around this time that Mike began to change his approach. He knew he had to move slowly, carefully, if he was going to re-enter Julia's life. He couldn't be too obvious, couldn't be too forceful. He had learned the hard way that subtlety was key. But the problem was, Mike wasn't good at subtlety anymore. His frustration with the way things had turned out, his jealousy, his anger, was bubbling beneath the surface, and he was having a hard time keeping it in check. Every interaction with Julia felt like it was tinged with something darker, something more insistent. And so, he began showing up at her favorite spots, places she used to frequent with Aaron. He would be there, in the background, watching her from afar. Sometimes, he would make sure they crossed paths, forcing casual conversations that were never truly casual. He began to chip away at the distance between them, trying to find a way to draw her back into his orbit, to make her see him again. He didn't know if he was doing it because he genuinely cared for her, or because he couldn't stand the idea of being rejected by her forever. But Julia was no fool. She noticed the change in Mike, and she could feel the subtle tension between them every time he was around. She had been avoiding him for weeks, trying to distance herself from the man who had once been a friend, but was now something entirely different. Someone consumed by obsession, someone she couldn't trust. She saw the way he watched her, the way his eyes lingered a little too long when they spoke. It made her uncomfortable. The air between them crackled with unspoken desire, and Julia knew that Mike wasn't simply trying to be friends again. He wanted something more. The challenge for Julia was knowing how to handle the situation. She couldn't just ignore Mike forever, but she also couldn't let him back into her life the way things had been before. She had to protect herself. She had to protect Aaron. And she had to protect her own peace of mind, something that felt increasingly fragile every time Mike entered the room. But as much as she tried to avoid him, there were moments when she felt her resolve slipping. There were moments when she would catch him looking at her, and she would feel that old spark of affection that, in the past, had been so easy to ignore, so easy to dismiss as just a fleeting feeling. But now it felt different. Now, the tension between them felt heavy, almost unbearable. And that was when Julia realized that Mike's presence in her life had become something more than a mere nuisance. It had become a force that she couldn't control. Mike's adaptation to this new reality, where every step forward seemed to push him further away from the things he wanted, was not without its costs. The more he tried to re-enter Julia's world, the more he alienated her. And the more he pushed, the further she pulled away. Every time he thought he had made a breakthrough, every time he thought he had cracked the door open just a little bit, it slammed shut in his face. Yet, Mike wasn't done. His obsession with Julia and the need to rebuild his fractured relationship with Aaron was something he couldn't walk away from. It was his purpose now. The questions that plagued him every night were simple, but relentless. How could he get Julia back? How could he fix his relationship with his brother? How could he regain the control he had lost? And as the answers eluded him, Mike's desperation grew. He was walking a tightrope, and with each misstep, the consequences became more and more severe. But he didn't know how to stop. The wheels were already in motion, and it felt as if there was no going back. Mike's persistence began to pay off, but not in the way he had expected. The path to getting what he thought he wanted, the return of Julia's attention, the rekindling of the bond with his brother, was more convoluted and darker than he could have imagined. What had begun as a quiet ache in his chest had morphed into a blinding need, and for the first time, Mike started to believe that he might actually get what he desired, even if it meant crossing every line he had once sworn never to break. The goal was no longer a mere aspiration. It had become an obsession, a singular mission to reclaim what he had lost. Julia's resistance had been steadfast, and Mike knew that she wasn't going to come to him willingly. She had made it clear, through silence and avoidance, that the boundaries she had set were not to be crossed. But Mike, with his bruised pride and festering jealousy, couldn't let go of the belief that he could bend the situation to his will. Over the course of the next few weeks, he began to subtly escalate his efforts, pushing boundaries in ways that were increasingly hard to ignore. It started innocuously enough. Mike's continued presence in the same social circles as Julia allowed him to work his way back into her life slowly. At first, he would accidentally run into her while she was out with friends or while she was at the coffee shop where she often studied. The moments were fleeting, but they were enough to maintain an illusion of normalcy. At least, for Mike, they were a small victory, but his actions became bolder. He made sure to sit at the table beside hers, subtly dropping his drink just to provoke a conversation. He would reach out to her in ways that made her feel uncomfortable, like sending text messages that teetered on the edge of flirtation, but veiled in what seemed like innocent friendliness. He would show up at events where she would be, not uninvited, but not exactly welcome either. His presence was pervasive in her life, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, it started to chip away at the barriers she had put up. Mike wasn't just trying to get her back in some romantic sense, he was trying to make her acknowledge him, to make her see that he was still there, still an option, still a part of the equation in ways that she couldn't easily ignore. For Julia, the slow but steady encroachment of Mike's presence in her life began to feel like an imposition. Initially, she tried to brush him off. She made excuses to avoid him. She started canceling plans with friends if she knew Mike would be around. She found herself growing irritable, on edge, as if she were living in a perpetual state of defense. She hadn't expected Mike to be so relentless. At the same time, she was still trying to preserve what little she had with Aaron. The strain between her and Mike, though subtle at first, started to affect her relationship with Aaron in ways she didn't want to acknowledge. She found herself having to explain more frequently why she was avoiding Mike, why she hadn't responded to his texts, why she didn't want to go to the bar if she knew he would be there. But even as she resisted, there were moments when the tug of attraction she had once felt for Mike resurfaced. She knew it was wrong, knew that she couldn't fall into that trap again. Yet, in some dark corner of her mind, she still remembered the way Mike used to make her laugh, the way he had been there for her before Aaron had come into the picture. For Mike, these moments of tension and resistance only fueled his obsession. Every interaction, no matter how small or fleeting, felt like a victory. He felt like he was slowly chipping away at the walls Julia had built around herself, like he was inching closer to a reconciliation of sorts. He had this feeling of momentum, like he was on the cusp of achieving something that he hadn't thought possible just a few weeks ago. But the problem with momentum is that it can carry you to places you didn't intend to go. And as Mike pushed harder, as he made his presence more and more impossible for Julia to ignore, he failed to see the warning signs that his actions were no longer about rekindling a friendship or even a romance. They were about possession. He had crossed into dangerous territory without even realizing it. One evening, Mike's persistence seemed to reach its peak. Julia had agreed to meet up with him at the local cafe, thinking that it was going to be a casual conversation between friends. She had reluctantly agreed because, despite her best efforts to distance herself from Mike, she had the nagging feeling that it was something she needed to do for her own peace of mind. Perhaps if they could talk it out, she thought, maybe they could clear the air and she could finally move forward without the constant presence of Mike in her life. They met in the corner booth of the cafe, and the atmosphere was tense from the moment she sat down. Mike had been waiting for her, a strange energy radiating from him. He was different, somehow. There was a purpose to his words, a sharpness to his gaze that made Julia feel uncomfortable. "I'm glad you agreed to meet," Mike said, his voice casual, but there was an edge to it that Julia couldn't quite place. She sat down slowly, unsure of how to respond. "Yeah, I thought it was time," she said, her voice guarded. She kept her hands clasped on the table, trying to avoid looking too directly at him. Mike leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he spoke. "I know things have been awkward, but I just want you to understand something. I don't want to lose you as a friend, Julia. I've never wanted that." His words hung in the air between them, almost too smooth to be completely truthful. Julia raised an eyebrow, sensing something deeper at play. "I thought we were already past this, Mike. We're not kids anymore." Her tone was firm, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Had she misunderstood him? Was this an apology? Mike's expression shifted, his eyes intense as he spoke again. "I don't think you really understand. I haven't been able to stop thinking about you, about us." You were always the one, Julia. And I think you know that." The words hit her like a wave. For a moment, Julia froze, her pulse quickening. She wanted to stand up and leave, but something kept her in place. "Mike, please," she said softly, shaking her head. "I don't think this is the right thing. You're not hearing me." But Mike was hearing only what he wanted to hear. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the flicker of something old and familiar. To him, it felt like a sign that she was finally coming around, that his efforts had not been in vain. He was finally getting what he had always wanted, her attention, her acknowledgement. And that was all he cared about now. Nothing else mattered. So, he pressed on, "I know you care about Aaron, but don't you care about me too? We've always had something, Julia. Don't you remember that? We can have it again." The confession hung in the air like a poisoned arrow. Julia's face paled as she processed what he was saying. The desperation in his voice was unmistakable. He wasn't looking for reconciliation. He wasn't trying to heal the friendship. He was asking for something more. "I think you should leave," Julia said quietly, standing up from the table. She couldn't bear it any longer. She couldn't listen to him make these empty, desperate pleas that didn't align with the person she knew Mike to be. He was no longer the man she had cared about. He was someone unrecognizable, a man who had become consumed by his desire, by his need to possess her in a way that was toxic and suffocating. Mike's heart sank as she stood. For a split second, he couldn't comprehend what was happening. He had thought he was so close to winning her back, and now she was walking away from him. "Julia, wait," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. But she didn't turn back. She left the cafe, leaving him there, alone with the bitter taste of failure in his mouth. For all his persistence, for all the subtle games he had played, he had gained nothing. And in that moment, Mike realized that the victory he had been fighting for, the victory he thought he had finally won, was nothing but a mirage. It was a false victory, one that had cost him not just Julia's friendship, but any semblance of peace or sanity he had left. He had wanted her back, but in the process, he had lost her forever. And worse, he had lost himself in the process. The realization was a sharp, painful blow. He had gotten everything he thought he wanted, and yet it had all slipped through his fingers. The emptiness he had been running from was now staring him in the face, and for the first time, Mike understood the full weight of his actions. What he had wanted, what he had fought for, was not what he needed, and the cost was far greater than he could have ever imagined. The taste of false victory was still sharp on Mike's tongue, bitter and unsettling. He had fought so hard to reclaim what he believed was his, Julia's attention, her love, her validation, but in the end, he had only succeeded in driving her further away. As he sat alone in the darkened cafe, the echo of her departure ringing in his ears, he couldn't help but replay every moment that had led him here. Had he miscalculated? Had his obsession, his need to possess her, clouded his judgment? He had wanted her back, yes, but now that he had her, only for a fleeting moment, it felt like nothing but a hollow achievement. The rush of adrenaline that had propelled him through weeks of stalking, manipulation, and forced encounters suddenly turned into a deep, gnawing regret. He had crossed lines, he had pushed boundaries, and in doing so, he had alienated the very people he had once cared about. More than that, he had broken something inside himself, a trust he had once shared with his brother, a bond with Julia that was now shattered beyond repair. Mike's mind raced as he stumbled out of the cafe into the cold night air. It felt like the world was closing in on him. The city lights blurred as he tried to make sense of the chaos swirling in his head. Julia was gone. His attempts to rekindle any connection had failed. Worse still, he had completely misjudged the gravity of his actions. His feelings for her had become so tangled with jealousy and entitlement that they had transformed into something darker, something that had eroded the foundation of every meaningful relationship he had ever known. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of his obsession became painfully clear. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had become an outsider in his own life, a man adrift in a sea of his own making. His interactions with Aaron had gone from strained to non-existent. His brother had distanced himself, as if to protect himself from the toxic air that Mike now carried with him wherever he went. And Julia, she was gone. He hadn't heard from her since that night in the cafe, and every text he sent went unanswered. She had finally closed the door on him, and he had no one to blame but himself. At first, Mike tried to keep busy, filling the emptiness with distractions, alcohol, late nights, random hookups. But none of it worked. The noise in his mind never quieted. He found himself replaying the worst moments of the last few months. The fight with Aaron, the confrontation with Julia, the strange sense of power he had felt as he pushed her closer and closer to a decision, only to have it all unravel. He had gotten what he wanted in a way, but in doing so, he had lost everything that truly mattered. The rift between him and Aaron was widening. Mike could feel it with every passing day. Aaron had always been his anchor, the person who understood him best, the one who had always been there when things got rough. But now, every time they crossed paths, whether it was at family events or just a random encounter, there was an unspoken coldness between them. Aaron wasn't looking at him the same way anymore. He didn't trust him, and Mike could feel it, deep in his chest, like a wound that wouldn't heal. It wasn't just the silence between them that was suffocating, it was the accusation that hung in the air. Mike could feel it in Aaron's eyes, even if his brother never said the words. The betrayal was palpable. Aaron had once believed in Mike, trusted him as his closest confidant, and now, in the wake of the fight, that trust was gone. The words Mike had spoken in the heat of that argument, the insults, the accusations, had shattered something irreplaceable. There was no taking them back. No apology could undo the damage. And Mike knew that Aaron wasn't going to forgive him.
Not now.
Not ever. One night, after another awkward encounter with Aaron at a family gathering, Mike found himself alone in his apartment, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring into the empty space. His hands trembled as he tried to steady the glass, but the alcohol did little to ease the pain gnawing at him. The isolation felt heavier than ever. He could hear his own thoughts louder than before, each one more self-critical, more accusatory than the last. What had he done? What was the cost of all this? He had been driven by a singular need to possess Julia, Aaron's love, control over the situation. But in the end, he had lost everything. And worse, he had become someone he didn't even recognize. The realization hit him like a freight train. His actions had gone far beyond the petty jealousy and emotional immaturity he had initially believed them to be. No, they were something darker, something more dangerous. Mike hadn't just been fighting for Julia's affection. He had been fighting for control, fighting to get back the things that had slipped away from him, not realizing that the very act of trying to reclaim them was destroying the foundation of everything that had once been good in his life. He had wanted power over his circumstances, over the people around him, but all he had done was unravel everything he had worked for. His brother, his own flesh and blood, now looked at him as a stranger. Julia had pulled away completely, leaving him with nothing but the aching, empty space where her presence used to be. And his own reflection, when he looked into the mirror, seemed like the face of someone he didn't recognize anymore. A stranger. A man consumed by his own desire, by the very things he thought he needed. It was then that the full weight of the consequences began to settle on Mike's shoulders. He had chased after something that was never truly his to take, and in doing so, he had destroyed every relationship that had once been important to him. Julia had chosen Aaron over him, and Mike had responded with violence, both physical and emotional, that had irrevocably changed the course of their lives. Aaron had been hurt, physically and emotionally, by Mike's betrayal, and that injury was something that couldn't be undone. The trust that had once existed between them was gone. Aaron would never look at him the same way again. The distance between them had grown too wide to bridge. And then there was the matter of Julia. Mike had become so fixated on winning her back that he had ignored the most important truth of all. She had never been his to claim. His obsession with her had been rooted in a need to possess, to prove something to himself, and it had led him to neglect the fact that Julia had always been a separate, autonomous person with her own desires, her own choices. She had chosen Aaron, And no matter how much Mike had tried to force his way into her life, she had the right to reject him, to move on without him. And that was exactly what she had done. The hardest pill to swallow, however, was the recognition that Mike had allowed his own insecurities, his own jealousy, and his misguided sense of entitlement to dictate his every action. He had spent so much time trying to control the narrative, trying to force a reality that didn't exist, that he had forgotten one simple truth. Love, trust, and respect can't be forced. They can't be controlled, and they can't be bought. Mike's desperation for love, for validation, had blinded him to the reality that true connection is built on mutual respect, not manipulation and obsession. Now, in the quiet aftermath of his actions, Mike had nothing left but the bitter taste of regret. The relationships that had once been the core of his life, his bond with Aaron, his friendship with Julia, were gone, destroyed by his own hands. And he couldn't undo it. He couldn't fix it. No apology, no attempt at reconciliation could erase the damage he had done. He had reached out for something that was never truly his, and in doing so, he had destroyed the very things he had cherished most. The cost was far higher than Mike had ever imagined. What he had thought was a simple desire for love, for attention, had turned into a destructive force that had torn apart the fabric of his life. And now, as he sat alone in the dark, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making, Mike was left to face the crushing realization that sometimes what we want most isn't what we need, and the price of our desires can be far steeper than we are willing to pay. And with that realization came the most painful truth of all. It wasn't just Aaron and Julia that Mike had lost. It was himself. The man he had been, the brother, the friend, the lover. Those identities had slipped away, swallowed up by the obsession, the jealousy, and the desperate need to possess. Mike had paid the ultimate price for his desires, and now he was left with nothing but the ruins of the life he had once known. And all he could do was sit with it. The silence, the isolation, the regret. These were the only things left, and they were far heavier than any victory could ever be. Mike had lost everything. The destructive power of his obsession had shattered his relationship with his brother Aaron, driven away the woman he had once hoped to claim, and left him alone in a world he no longer recognized. But what struck him most profoundly in the wake of his actions was not the external damage, the physical isolation from those he had once loved, but the profound internal emptiness that consumed him. The man who had once been certain of his place in the world was now adrift in a sea of guilt, regret, and self-loathing. He had been so intent on forcing a reality that never existed, so fixated on getting what he wanted, that he had lost sight of the one thing that had always grounded him, the connection with the people who truly mattered. Now, as he sat in the aftermath of his choices, Mike had to come to terms with the painful reality that he had pushed those connections beyond repair. The days following the events at the family party, the violent confrontation, and the final realization that both Julia and Aaron had closed the door on him were marked by a deep, soul-crushing silence. Mike had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to manipulate outcomes in his favor. But now, the very thing that had driven him to destroy those relationships was the very thing that left him powerless. There was no escape from his own thoughts, no way to outrun the consequences of his actions. The alcohol, the late nights, the distractions, all of them had become hollow pursuits. What Mike had been looking for in these fleeting moments of escape, he found nowhere but in the mirror, staring back at himself. And what he saw was a man lost, a man who had thrown away everything of value for the fleeting satisfaction of his own desire. His phone had remained silent. The text to Julia went unanswered. The calls to Aaron were ignored. Even his family, who had once rallied around him during tough times, seemed to have distanced themselves, as if they too knew there was no way to reconcile the man Mike had become with the person he once was. It was in these moments of isolation that Mike finally confronted the truth that had been staring him in the face all along. His pursuit of control, of validation, had turned him into a person he didn't recognize, someone he loathed. And the realization was both a relief and a crushing burden. He spent days reflecting, trying to piece together what had gone wrong, why things had spiraled so far out of control. His mind went back to the beginning, to the first stirrings of jealousy, when he had first noticed the closeness between Aaron and Julia. He had convinced himself that it wasn't just about love, it was about his own worth, his own need to feel important. And somewhere along the way, his desire for attention had morphed into an obsession. He had pushed, manipulated, and fought for something that, in the end, was never meant to be his. The truth was uncomfortable. He had wanted to win, but in doing so, he had lost everything he truly valued. In the quiet of his apartment, Mike began the painful process of looking inward. It wasn't easy. He had spent so much of his life avoiding his own vulnerabilities, hiding behind the bravado that had once served as his armor. But the anger, the jealousy, the desire to control, it all stemmed from the same root: insecurity. He had been afraid of losing his place in the world, afraid of being overshadowed by his brother, afraid of being rejected by Julia. He had projected these fears outward, and in doing so, he had destroyed the very things he feared losing most. It wasn't just about Julia anymore, or even Aaron. It was about the fragile, fractured version of himself he had become. He had sacrificed his integrity, his relationships, and ultimately his sense of self, all in pursuit of something that was never truly his to claim. It was then that the deepest and most painful truth of all surfaced. The thing he had wanted most, the power, the control, was ultimately hollow. It had never been about love. It had never been about connection. It had been about him, about his own fear of inadequacy. And now, in the wake of his actions, he was left with nothing but the ruins of his own ego. In his isolation, Mike found himself a skin. Do what he could possibly do to make things right. The people he had hurt, Aaron, Julia, even his own family, were gone, and there was no way to turn back the clock. The things he had said to Aaron during that fight, the things he had done to Julia, the damage was done. Words, once spoken, could never be taken back. Actions, once carried out, could never be undone. So, what was left for him? Redemption? Forgiveness? Could those things even be possible for someone who had lost his way as completely as Mike had? Slowly, the answer came. Not in a burst of inspiration, but in the quiet acceptance that his path forward wasn't about repairing what had been broken. It was about accepting the consequences of his actions and learning from them. It was about coming to terms with the reality that sometimes we cannot undo the damage we've caused. We can't erase the mistakes, but we can choose to live differently from this moment forward. Mike didn't need to seek redemption from others, not from Aaron, not from Julia, not from anyone. Redemption, he realized, had to come from within. But this realization was not the end of his journey. It was just the beginning of something much harder, the path of personal responsibility. It wasn't enough to feel remorse. It wasn't enough to acknowledge his mistakes. Mike had to change. He had to be the one to make things right, not by repairing his relationships, but by rebuilding himself from the ground up. The first step on that path was painful. He had to face the person he had become. No more running from the truth. No more blaming others. No more justifications for his behavior. Mike had to own the ugly parts of himself, the jealousy, the obsession, the fear that had driven him to hurt others. It was a humbling and often excruciating process. He began writing in a journal, trying to make sense of his emotions, of the destructive patterns he had fallen into. He took long walks in the evenings, allowing himself to reflect without the distractions that had once clouded his mind. And in this quiet space, away from the noise of the world, he began to piece together who he truly was beneath the layers of resentment and shame. It wasn't just about internal reflection, it was also about small, deliberate actions. Mike started showing up at family events again, though he was met with cold silence from some and wary eyes from others. The distance between him and Aaron remained, but Mike knew that earning back trust would take time and humility. He didn't expect forgiveness overnight, and he didn't feel entitled to it. But showing up, being present, and doing the work to change was his first step. He also started attending therapy, something he had long resisted but now realized was necessary for him to understand the roots of his destructive behavior and begin to heal. The most difficult part was letting go of Julia. He had been holding on to a fantasy of what could have been, a vision of the future that was never going to materialize. Julia was no longer a symbol of something he wanted to possess. She was simply another person in his life who had moved on. And he had to respect that. No amount of regret or longing could bring back what they once shared. His relationship with her, whatever it had been, was now in the past. And as painful as it was, Mike had to let go of the dream of what could have been. The hardest part of his journey was realizing that sometimes, in order to heal, you have to let go of the people who have hurt you, and sometimes that means forgiving yourself for the harm you've caused others. It was a slow, often painful process, but as the weeks passed, Mike began to feel a shift inside himself. He wasn't the same man who had walked down the dark road of obsession and jealousy. He had changed. And while the scars of his actions would never completely disappear, they no longer defined him. He was learning to live with them, to accept the consequences, to accept the person he had been, and to choose to be different from that person moving forward. By the time he saw Aaron again, months later, there was no expectation of reconciliation. They spoke briefly, awkwardly, but Mike knew that the path to healing wasn't through words. It was through action. It was through the quiet work of becoming a person who could be trusted, a person who could be counted on. He wasn't there yet, but he was on his way. And that, for Mike, was enough. The truth, he realized, was that redemption was not a destination. It was a journey of facing the truth, of accepting responsibility, and of slowly but surely trying to make things right. It was something that could never be rushed, could never be forced. And as he walked this path, he understood that the lessons he had learned, the painful, hard-earned lessons, were the only things that had the power to heal the broken parts of himself. And in that quiet acceptance, Mike finally found peace.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.